foreign direct investments can play an important role in delivering the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Investment flows help advance a nation's development by bringing about capital, employment, even export opportunities, talking about greater consumer choice, advanced technologies, managerial experience, and of course, overall economic growth. In 2017, 70 economies started a process at the World Trade Organization with the goal to develop a new agreement on investment facilitation for development. 3 years later, negotiations were launched during the World Economic Forum annual meeting in 2020 in Davos, with 98 economies supporting the process. Since then, the World Trade Organization's trade facilitation agreements have been fruitful. In voting for the landmark arrangement and agreement, WTO members realized its potential to drive inclusive economic growth, while also recognizing that some countries will require help in implementing all its provisions. As of January 2023, there are over 110 economies that have reached a new draft agreement, cutting red tape and making investments easier across all sectors of the economy. How will Africa and African countries benefit from these deliberations and new agreements signed? Now, joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Lekan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst, and of course is the CEO of Reach Management. It's nice to have you join us, Lekan, on Business Edge. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start this way. How would you describe global trade, the state of global trade, and the impact it has had on Africa over the course of the years?
Well, I think, obviously global trade has been in a strong uptrend until we hit the problems with COVID, and then the decoupling story, the increasing friction we've seen that's occurred over the last 24 months, particularly between the US and China. The idea of friendshoring has gained momentum. And I think in the context of Africa, I think firstly, Africa's got to look at trade on the continent. I think that's a really important factor. And then secondly, Africa's got to look at increasing value for its exports out of the continent. I think those are the main important takeaways. In near term, I think the opening up of China is going to be a net positive for the continent as well.
All right, now we believe that foreign direct investments can actually deliver the SDG agenda that has been much touted about by economists all over the globe and of course in Africa. But then there are some bottlenecks. Now, what are the challenges that African countries are facing in terms of attracting foreign direct investments, and how do you think those challenges can be dealt with?
So the challenges we face on the continent are multiple challenges. First of all, one of scale. A number of, we're 54 countries. So what tends to happen is the FDI, for example, last year, South Africa took 50% of all the incoming FDI. So you can see that we really need to consolidate our offering, preferably into more of a singular Africa offering. The other problem with multiple countries is we have multiple different jurisdictions, and also different countries have a different awareness of the right approach to take in order to make individual countries attractive to FDI. But overall, I think the overall trend is increased FDI, particularly in resource-based economies, because a lot of the minerals and what's needed to drive the next century in terms of the economy is based in Africa. So I think it's a question of making it a flat environment, making it easy for people to come in and take out their money if they wish to. And once you get into that virtuous circle, we should see more money come in.
So within the virtual circle, would you say that there has been enough transparency, most especially among these African countries, because most of them have actually maintained a protectionist stance, socio-economically, socio-politically. So do you think that they are being transparent enough, or it's all about what comes to me, what I can benefit, whatever it is that other parties get to benefit is none of my business?
That's a very interesting way of framing it. I think too many countries, for example, don't understand that if you're going to succeed in FDI, you've got to make it easy for people to come in and just as easy for them to go out. A lot of our countries have tracked investments, and because of foreign exchange challenges, have not allowed people to exit. When you don't allow money, when you trap money in your economy, no one else is able then to put additional money in. So it becomes a zero-sum game. And you tend to find that, the situation just becomes blocked. And there are a number of countries that are suffering from that point. And I think also, we're not thinking smart enough. We can attract FDI, potentially attract factories to develop our raw materials before we export them. But in order to do that, we've really got to think a lot more intelligently than some of our policymakers have been thinking until now. There are interesting differences on the continent. You cited Egypt in your introduction. Now, I know Egypt has had a devaluation of about 50%, but by allowing that to happen, you've already seen an enormous turnaround in money coming into Egypt since the beginning of the year. So you've got to have a flexible approach to this. You can't get stuck and basically lock down your foreign exchange, for example. And also, some policymakers need to appreciate that more money, when people see others making a profit, they tend to follow up, and you get more money that comes in that sort of scenario. So I think we should not be afraid of investors making good returns. And if they do, it's going to attract others in as well.
It's quite nice that you mentioned Egypt, because one of its aspects, that is the economy that is actually bringing in money for the country, is the tourism sector. And that's how powerful the social economy can actually impact the economy of a particular country. And that brings me to this next question that has to do with a United Nations report talking about a social economy having the capacity to have brought about 7% of global GDP. And it said it contributed about a huge amount of increase in employment generation for these economies. So, of course, there are challenges, no doubt about that. But then looking at the potential that social economy has, can it actually assist developing countries to harness their potentials and bring about a more transformative and, of course, a more burgeoning economy for them?
Yes, so that's an interesting contrast you're making. I mean, the tourism economy is enormous, and it has a multiplier effect, in the sense that it employs so many people. I've seen various types of research which indicate that, the multiplier effect is like tenfold in terms of employment, because a tourist will buy something, a token, it will be made by somebody else, and it creates multiple employment opportunities. So in terms of the social economy, tourism is probably the best and most positive example of a multiplier effect. And in that sense, the multiplier effect is very much to be contrasted with an extractive mine where somebody might employ 1,000 people. But, you look at Egypt's tourism sector, it produces enormous value for the economy. And of course, now with the devaluation, it's going to be even more attractive to people all over the world.
All right, let's talk about African countries. One of the potential it has is human capital. Africa has that in droves, but then there have been challenges about job creation and not being able to tap into the necessary resources to generate enough jobs to create employment for its teeming population. But then they are looking towards foreign counterparts, multinational companies and all that. Should they continue to look towards these foreign companies, most especially at a time whereby these multinational companies are actually shutting down their companies, their manufacturing hubs, and they're pushing their investments back home. Now, when we have that kind of juxtaposition, do you think that it will be healthy for African countries to continue to look at these other countries in the foreign space to generate jobs for them?
So that's a very interesting question, and it goes back to the demographic dividend about which everyone speaks, which is this very youthful African population we have. But in order to enjoy the fruits of a demographic dividend, you need firstly to educate your people. So I think, the first piece of this puzzle is actually education. And then that education needs to be tailored to the economy that we're witnessing today. So, your education program has to be appropriate for creating jobs for those people who will constitute the demographic dividend. Now, in terms of whether multinationals are going to be the provider of jobs, I'm not convinced. I think, more importantly, firstly, is going to be domestic businesses which are growing. So it's really the local economy. Once it's thriving, it needs more and more people in order to make it successful. And that will be the primary driver of jobs on the continent. Of course, with the internet, it's quite interesting because the world is very flat. So a lot of these multinationals can now get remote workers on the continent. But in order to achieve that, you need a good internet connection. So I think, as I said, it's education. It's also tailoring that education for the 21st century. And then there will be opportunities. Multinationals, in my view, will probably provide between 5 to 10% of the job opportunities. But there's that 90% which will need to be provided by indigenous private businesses across this continent of ours, and possibly by remote working, which I think can really take off because of the cost arbitrage. It's much cheaper, for example, to hire somebody in Africa than it might be, for example, in the Western world. And as long as you have that arbitrage, then I think, we should see significant employment from that side.
All right. Now, we understand that FDI is all about funding and generating funds. But then the world is still battling with inflation, recession, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the aftershocks that comes with it. And of course, apex banks of different countries are raising and pushing up their interest rates. So should Africa still be looking at the possibility of a commendable amount of FDIs coming into Africa, despite all these global challenges being faced with?
So that's another interesting question. Firstly, let me point out that inward remittances overtook FDIs some time ago. And so, there is all this money that's coming in. Admittedly, it's coming in at a family support level in the most part, but it's a significant amount of money. And we should also be considering that when we're looking for investment into the continent. Your point about the world being squeezed by the Ukraine war, the post-COVID outcome, of course, Africa got squeezed. We had portfolio outflows out of the continent for the last 2 years. FDI flows actually slowed down quite dramatically. So I think, there is a story in the medium term which makes Africa very, very attractive. This is the demographic story. The future workforce of the world is going to be African if you look at the population numbers. So that story is very much intact. But I think, the complexity has arisen. Higher interest rates, lower risk appetite has meant that Africa has been at the sharp end of that trend and of that blade. We've got to bear that in mind, deal with it, and make ourselves attractive in the context of a tougher world where people are looking for better risk-adjusted returns. I think we're beginning to see that since the beginning of the year. There's been a bit of risk on. There's been a more better appetite for higher risk, perceived higher risk investments. And I think we should see a rebound happen this year.
All right, Lekan, now let's talk about debt discussions that have been going on among countries with their creditors, the G20s, and all that. And it's becoming a global phenomenon now where countries are looking at debt restructuring and turning their converting their debt, so to speak, into securities. Now, will these bonds perform well on the markets?
So I think in terms of, I suspect you're talking about these current debt restructurings we're seeing in Zambia,
yes. Ghana,
Chad,
yes,
and now Ghana. Look, I think it's a highly sensitive issue. I've been following it closely. Chad is a small situation. It is largely to do with an oil company which was funding the Chadian government. So it wasn't a complicated restructuring to undertake. Zambia, more complicated. You've got Eurobonds, you've got China, you've got bilateral lenders. It's taken much longer than I think it should have done, but I suspect it's going to be resolved reasonably soon. I think, somewhere like Ghana, I've got to feel sympathy for domestic bondholders because the price they're being forced to pay, which is essentially in a highly inflationary environment, they're getting coupon rates which are single digits, if that, after a number of years. I think the price those holders are having to pay for the restructuring exercise in Ghana is quite brutal. I mean, it's incredible. So we've got a whole spectrum going on. Obviously, countries are in distress. That number has increased. There is a way out of this, but the amount of punishment some holders of these securities are taking is, I think, extremely egregious and extreme. And then it speaks to, policy-making failures. The countries that have found themselves in these situations are because their economies were mismanaged, money was overborrowed, it was not spent effectively. I think the positive outcome would be if citizens now hold their governments to account and don't allow this to happen again.
But then you talk about the modalities and the terms of conditions for these credits being provided by the creditors to the borrowers as punishment. Now, why would they term them as punishments? Because, of course, as at the time of negotiation, agreements are made, and agreements are made after they have considered all these terms and conditions, and these countries who are open to borrow these monies are saying, okay, we are well and okay with the provisions of these conditions, and they go ahead to sign the agreement to get these credit facilities. So why would you consider them as punishment?
So what I'm saying is, let's take the scenario of Ghana, which was able to borrow billions of dollars from the capital markets and is now in default. In the restructuring exercise, they are basically they're not reducing the principal. They're saying your principal is intact, but going forward, your interest rate will be 0 for 5 years, then 2.5% for another 5 years. Now, who are the holders of these securities? The holders of these securities are local banks, local institutions, and by extension, African citizens. And what I'm saying is that because of the mistakes that have been made, the overborrowing that was incurred, the price that it is being exacted on domestic holders is very brutal. So therefore, I think as citizens, at the time of borrowing, we've got to be much more aggressive in holding our government's feet to the fire and making sure these loans are not being taken for pet projects and projects which will never give an adequate return. I think we need to interrogate our governments much more. The markets swing from feast to famine. At the time of a feast, all our guys go out there and borrow as much as they can, but they should know that when the famine comes, they're going to have to pay back these funds. And we can't keep going into this cycle of a failure to pay back the funds and then a vicious restructuring where locals essentially and citizens are bearing a tremendous burden which is what I think is happening in Ghana.
I think that is where the conversation is, having to borrow money and plugging it in areas that are not yielding interest or benefits whatsoever, as it were. And that's what is even happening in Nigeria. But then the Nigerian government said that it has actually invested those funds it got from the creditors, as it were, for infrastructural development. But then there are debts being incurred to the tune of over 70 trillion. And people are asking, how will that be paid when there are no yields on investments being made, as it were? But then thank you so much, Lekan Satchu, for joining us on this conversation. It's been quite nice having you delve into this and open up what we need to understand as regards this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.